Hi, and welcome to Lizscapism. Last year, during CocoVid, I released a video which explored how to find tips on costume creation from works of period literature, using Pride and Prejudice as my example text. This year, for the Costume Symposium, I'm doing it again. This time, instead of Pride and Prejudice, we'll look at different characters from Oscar Wilde's ultimate theatrical work, The Importance of Being Earnest. Period literature, that is to say literature written during the historical period you are researching, is a wonderful way to draw inspiration for costumes. Very much like today, there are infinite shades of meaning in the details of fashion choices, and a lot of it reflects your personality. But finding that personality and nuance is hard when you're researching the period from an academic or historical perspective only. Those sources give you the big picture, the silhouette, the textiles, the general look, but when you read a work of period literature, you are exposed to multiple characters with unique personalities and who, it logically follows, would make slightly different fashion choices. But they would still all be dressed in the style of the period. So how do we make allowances for these differences in personality and style while still staying true to the period? This is a skill that film and theater costume designers consider all the time, especially for adaptations. And when they look at the original text, they aren't only looking for clothing descriptions. They are also looking for what the characters say, how they behave, and how others behave around them. So we will look at two pairs of characters from a play, and use the text to explore how we would dress them differently. And then towards the end, I will read two passages outlining the final pair of characters, and it will be your job to discuss in the comments how these two would dress. This was my absolute favorite part of last year's video. The comment section was an absolute delight, and despite having read the book about 5 million times, there are ideas and suggestions that I would have never thought of. I hope we can have the same kinds of awesome discussions this year. And now on to the characters. The first two characters we will examine are Lady Augusta Bracknell and Miss Letitia Prism. I'm pairing these characters both because of their similarity in age and because they are obvious foils of each other in the play. Lady Bracknell is the main driver of conflict in the first act, and in Act 3, Miss Prism's confession is what effectively resolves the conflict. They have a mutual past, and it's clear from their names that Wilde himself had paired them in his mind. Miss Prism's first name is Letitia, a name originating from a Roman goddess of joy. This goddess's likeness was very often stamped on Roman coins, the other side of which would depict the current emperor. Roman emperors were titled Augustus, which is shortened to AVG on the coins. The feminized version of Augustus is Augusta. Letitia and Augusta are literally two sides of the same coin. Oscar Wilde's specialization while at Trinity College and then at Oxford was in the classics, ancient Greek and Roman literature. So if it wasn't on purpose, it is the most magnificent Freudian slip that ever occurred in literature. So let's talk about Lady Bracknell. Lady Bracknell, known alternately by her nephew as Aunt Augusta, is a society lady of the English aristocracy. Our very first introduction to the character is the following.
Good afternoon, dear Algernon. I hope you are behaving very well.
I'm feeling very well, Aunt Augusta.
That's not quite the same thing. In fact, the two things rarely go together.
I love this introduction of a character. Aunt Augusta comes into the room, begins with a greeting that no one in the history of the world has used before, I hope you are behaving very well, and then when the response is that her nephew is feeling well, she observes that behaving well and feeling well are not the same thing and in fact diametrically opposed. These little bon mots, these turns of phrase, described by one critic as chiseled apothegms, are a hallmark of Oscar Wilde's work. This is a wonderful way to get your foot in the door with the character of Lady Bracknell. Frankly, if these were the only lines she had in the whole play, I think you could make a pretty apt costume choice for her. Lady Bracknell's dialogue from the very beginning of the story demonstrates a woman who, though perhaps a little too focused on propriety and maintaining decorum, is nevertheless highly intelligent and observant. By the by, if you ever hear anyone with a background in film, acting, or theater say the phrase, "a handbag," in a funny or overly imperious way, they're referencing Lady Bracknell's line, which is considered to be one of the most versatile lines in the history of English theater.
A handbag?
Here we've got handbag, what goes with them?
A handbag?
Would you please say a handbag for me?
A handbag.
There we go.
A handbag.
A key moment for Lady Bracknell's personality is in her interview with Jack Worthing, where she makes the following declarations with regards to smoking.
A man should always have an occupation of some kind. There are far too many idle men in London as it is.
With regards to knowledge and education.
I do not approve of anything that tampers with natural ignorance. Ignorance is like a delicate exotic fruit, touch it and the bloom is gone. The whole theory of modern education is radically unsound.
Due to her class and self-confidence, Lady Bracknell can say the most extraordinary, extravagant things, and by the pure power of her personality, they become true enough, or they reveal something more inherently true about people in her position and social class. My favorite example of this is that when finding out that two couples in the same country house are engaged, she declares,
I do not know whether there is anything peculiarly exciting in the air of this particular part of Hertfordshire, but the number of engagements that go on seems to me considerably above the proper average that statistics have laid down for our guidance.
This line is devilishly clever, because even though statistics aren't laid down for our guidance, they merely attempt to record facts, people even to this day will use statistics this way to validate their worldview. People begin to imagine the average to be acceptable and anything above or below average to be in some way wrong or undesirable. If you ever want proof that we still use statistics in this way, go on any real estate website and find the information regarding neighborhood statistics. You won't only find nearby schools and grocery stores, you'll also find things like income and ethnic demographics. This is just one part of the recursive discrimination that occurs to cause home values to go down in areas with higher than average immigrant, low income, or renter populations. But I digress. Lady Bracknell may be a caricature of London high society, but she is deliciously self-aware, and her dialogue replete with metatextual commentary on the society that she occupies. It's hard not to eat up every morsel of her bizarre worldview. Her foil, her opposing counterpart in the play, is Letitia Prism, an unmarried older woman working as a governess and ladies' companion. It's hard to imagine on first examination that two characters could be more different from each other than Lady Bracknell and Miss Prism, but a lot of their dialogue runs along similar lines, and they're clearly preoccupied with the same ideas a lot of the time, though they express them in slightly different ways. Like many women in her position in society, it is likely that Miss Prism was born into a higher class than she currently occupies. Many women who could not marry or inherit money to maintain their social status were forced into a strange gray area between servitude and gentility, but having an education and a serviceable knowledge of society, they would be tasked with the education of wealthy people's children. And sometimes, in the case of female children who grew up into teenagers, they would become lady companions, a kind of best friend on retainer who wasn't quite a maid, but probably did more than her share of chores. Miss Prism, therefore, despite not having any rank or fortune, has all the hallmarks of a gentlewoman. Her introduction is also very telling.
Cecily, surely such a utilitarian occupation as the watering of flowers is rather Moulton's duty than yours, especially at a moment when intellectual pleasures await you. Your German grammar is on the table. Pray open it at page 15. We will repeat yesterday's lesson.
Miss Prism's insistence that Cecily, a young heiress, not water flowers as it is the duty of the servants, already puts me in mind of the propriety of Lady Bracknell, though said with less extravagant style. She, like Lady Bracknell, wants her charge to be behaving well. But then we take a little turn. Instead of deriding education and the tampering of natural ignorance, Miss Prism exalts education as a time of pleasure and enjoyment. Except, I cannot think of anything that would sound less thrilling than repeating yesterday's German grammar lesson. No offense to German or grammar, but the phrase "repeat yesterday's lesson" is a very depressing one to hear. Miss Prism's discussions with Cecily, Dr. Chasuble, and Jack all contain similar turns of phrase as Lady Bracknell, but they feel less extravagant and more grounded, though often just as funny. In regards to a 3-volume novel she wrote when she was younger, she says,
"The good ended happily, and the bad unhappily. That is what fiction means."
Her and Dr. Chasuble's attempts at intelligent conversation as a means of impressing each other are especially funny. Phrases like,
"I spoke horticulturally. My metaphor was drawn from fruits."
Miss Prism might at first seem like a doddering, soft-hearted old lady in comparison with Lady Bracknell, but a few phrases let us know that Miss Prism has barbs of her own. Her hard-heartedness is mostly revealed in discussing the fictitious wastrel Ernest, but there are a few other moments where Miss Prism shows her colors. A favorite phrase of hers is, "As a man sows, so shall he reap." She utters this phrase twice in the final version of the play, but she says it a third time in a scene that was struck from the final version of the play. Because the scene was a favorite of Wilde's, it was preserved, and it has been reinserted into many subsequent adaptations and stagings of the play, and even appears in the 2002 film version. I just think it's significant that even in the material that didn't make it into the final version, Miss Prism is still using this phrase. In one of the many moments of the play that over-exaggerates the gravity of religious matters, Jack Worthing asks Dr. Chasuble if he is often performing christenings, also known as baptisms. Miss Prism says,
It is, I regret to say, one of the rector's most constant duties in this parish. I have often spoken to the poorer classes on the subject, but they don't seem to know what thrift is.
This perspective of the lower classes having too many children and being spendthrifts is very similar to Lady Bracknell's line about statistics, both in that it is ridiculous, but also that it is a belief that was and is genuinely espoused. Similar to folks using statistics to reinforce discrimination and a very narrow worldview, there are people in the world today who genuinely believe that low-income populations just need to stop having children and be better with money in order to solve all their problems. Oscar Wilde's subtitle for this play is A Trivial Comedy for Serious People, and it lives up to that moniker mostly in these two women, who both take themselves very seriously and say very silly things, which have a strangely serious undertone. These declarations suggest that both of these women have the courage of their convictions and in many ways a very similar worldview. I believe that the class distinction between them is a telling feature. If Miss Prism had the money to not rely on teaching, she could afford to treat education with the same contempt as her literary counterpart. So with all that said, how would you dress these women? Being different in class, but very similar in personality, are there ways that we can reflect that? First, I think that both women being obsessed with propriety and the right way of doing things would mean that neither of them would ever have a single thread out of place. No hat would be at too jaunty an angle, no trim too large or showy, and no hair askew. These women are bastions of their place in life, down to the smallest detail. I feel like for Lady Bracknell, all hats, accessories, and details would match her gown in color and pattern. Fashion for women during this time included very structured gowns whose embellishments emphasized that structure, so trim would follow the angles and edges of clothing or be used to form simple geometric patterns. Older women's fashion tended towards the less embellished, relying more on printed textiles or on applique designs to reflect that geometric trend. Lace was for cuffs and collars unless you were younger, in which case you could dress up more like a French fancy. Lady Bracknell would have a dressmaker in London who has her measurements and a very intimate knowledge of that lady's tastes. Lady Bracknell's confidence that she could change the fashionable side of a street is proof enough that if she had not perfectly conformed to fashion, then fashion would conform around her. For Miss Prism, by comparison, a certain level of practicality and thrift might override the most current fashions, but always while maintaining the proper silhouette, likely through small adjustments to staple items. A plain white shirtwaist, so long as the sleeves were of a moderately fashionable size, could be paired with whatever skirt was current and proper, and save the trouble of needing too many matching outfits. Being a resident governess, Miss Prism probably wouldn't do her own mending, but would very likely direct a maid to do it. Updating a skirt or jacket with new trim would be sensible, and not too much of an extravagance. I have no doubt that she would sport timeless classics as her accessories, in basic colors to match as many outfits in as many seasons as possible. And now we're going to take a quick break to thank my Patreon patrons. They will be getting a special bonus video this week, a segment that was cut from my gender and costuming video where I try out a male stage makeup tutorial. For this and other perks like it, make sure to join my Patreon at the link below. And remember that this weekend is the CosTube Symposium. Hundreds of videos are coming out, and there is also Instagram events and a special attendee Discord server. There will be playlists of all of the videos being released this weekend, or if you prefer, you can check out the full PDF program of the event. Links to both are below. Make sure to check it out. This event has been an absolute blast to take part in, and I am blown away by all the work that everyone has already done to pull it off. I am currently recording this in the middle of the Kosai Book Bash that I'm hosting on Instagram, and I gotta say, you guys are all amazing. I'm so impressed with all of the costumes and all of the books and all of the bookish things that everyone is sharing. It is really so much fun. Thank you everyone who participated or will continue to participate over the course of the day. It has been a hoot. And congratulations to everyone on the Kosai 2021 team for everything they have done to make this event such a success. If you are collecting badges, the link to the Google form to fill out, simply labeled Google form, is in the description. After submitting that form, a volunteer will send you the badge. Your badge will arrive in less than 24 hours, but please be patient. These folks are volunteers and still need to sleep, eat, and release their own videos. And speaking of which, back to the video. So on to our next two characters. Jack Worthing and Algernon Moncrief. These two London bachelors are much more obviously two sides of the same coin, as is pointed out almost immediately in the first act of the play. However, there are some key differences that might make dressing them especially fun for an exacting costumer. John, or Jack Worthing, is a wealthy man who maintains his air of respectability and decorum by creating an alternate persona. Living as his fictitious brother Ernest, Jack is able to live carefree in an extravagant lifestyle of a bachelor, drinking, courting, eating out, and generally living the life of pleasure in London. When living in his country home as himself, he maintains a personality of austerity and reserve. He is responsible for a young girl's upbringing, and this is probably why he cannot be quite so public about his pleasure-seeking side. His good friend, Algernon Moncrief, is living a life of pleasure in his own name, but has invented a fictitious friend who is perpetually ill and requires constant visiting. Algernon, or Algy, is therefore able to escape social demands of his Aunt Augusta and scurry off to the country whenever he likes. I submit to you that even though they are both supposed to be frivolous and only pretend to be respectful some of the time, one of these men is sensible by default and the other frivolous by default. And I think this is where to start with their costume differences. So let's explore. While Jack's persona Ernest is meant to be frivolous and carefree like his friend Algy, his first line in the play concludes with a criticism of the excesses of Algy when he says,
Eating as usual, I see, Algy.
"What kind of comment is that for around tea time? Of course you'd eat at that time." Immediately upon his entrance, Jack has already shown his colors as the more serious of the two men. This pattern continues throughout the entire play and is most evident when he is speaking to Algy. His signature line in the play is,
Oh, that's nonsense, Algy. You never talk anything but nonsense.
even when he's pretending to be a carefree spendthrift and a decadent bachelor about town. Jack cannot help but be sensible. He lectures Algy about his spending, about his eating, about his behavior. When telling Algy that Cecily refers to him as Uncle Jack, he says it is out of
Motives of respect that you could not possibly appreciate.
So while he is a person who's capable of enjoying himself, of being a little reckless maybe, and of having some fun, it seems as though Jack's default position is one of respectability and sense. Algernon Moncrief, the son and nephew of wealth and privilege, has developed his persona so that he can have an excuse to leave London and enjoy himself in the country or wherever. Though while he shirks his duty and responsibility, the same as Jack, his responsibilities are more of a shallow nature, mostly involving dinners with his aunt. So in the same way that Jack's pleasure-loving side still has the shine of sense, Algy's responsibilities that he is so eager to avoid seem to still have the shine of frivolity. And while I did just defend Algy's eating at tea time, it seems that there isn't a moment in the play where he isn't eating something. Algy is the spiritual antecedent to Brad Pitt's character in Ocean's 11. Whether he's being casual and silly or trying to be sincere and, forgive the pun, earnest, he is either eating or talking about how hungry he is. He doesn't commit himself to learning to play the piano accurately, and he insists that nothing in the world would induce him to give up his friend Bunbury. Even though he does eventually, the story of his friend's demise is an amusingly silly story, full of the kind of frivolous truisms and bon mots that Algy's language has always contained.
Bunbury? Oh, he was quite exploded. I mean, he was found out. The doctors found out that Bunbury could not live. That is what I mean. So Bunbury died.
He can't even be sensible without being a little silly at the same time. Like Aunt Augusta and Miss Prism, Algy and Jack are very aptly named. Algernon is a French name that originally meant a man with mustaches, a perfect name for a Victorian dandy. Jack, a derivation of John, is about as biblical and old a name as there is, a very sensible name. So how would we dress these fellows? Personally, I think that Jack's garments would very effectively reflect that his excesses and frivolities are mostly external. Not wanting to bankrupt himself entirely in the pursuit of a double life, I can easily imagine that jackets, trousers, shirts, and coats would be serviceable for both personalities. It is in the accessories that Jack would distinguish himself from Ernest. His neckties, hats, gloves, these are ornaments that you could hang on an otherwise plainly dressed fellow to give off the illusion of a man who is living solely for pleasure. Pops of color, more expensive fabrics, taller hats, shinier ornamentations and watch chains, and perhaps, given his natural state as a sensible person, maybe he's not very good at that more exuberant style. The same way that Jack hassles Algy about food, Algy repeatedly mocks Jack for his wardrobe, declaring to Cecily at one point that,
I certainly wouldn't let Jack buy my outfit. He has no taste in neckties at all.
At another moment in the play, Algy insists that Jack get changed and says,
I never saw anybody take so long to dress and with such little result.
It's pretty easy to imagine that Algy's dress therefore would, by comparison, fully encompass the image of the 19th century dandy, a fellow whose love of color, lustrous fabrics, texture, and aesthetics would make him stand out anywhere. I imagine that Algy's attempt to make himself seem more sensible would be to wear his flashy velvet jackets and silk waistcoats with maybe a plain cravat and cuffs with plain buttons instead of gold filigree. And he would think the whole time that it was a degradation and a very betrayal to the idea of taste. I think it's tempting for us to think that there was no way that 19th century gentlemen could distinguish themselves in their dress, and it's just not true. And I think that Jack and Algy are a really good example of how these things can be distinguished in very subtle but very effective ways. Now, like I did last year, I'm going to read some short passages which I hope will inspire you to draw your own conclusions about our last two characters. Your homework, entirely voluntary of course, is to discuss your thoughts and ideas in the comments. Please let me know what you think. It doesn't matter how many times I read a thing. Other people always surprise me with their ideas and insights. Cecily Cardew and Gwendolyn Fairfax are the love interests of our two bachelors above, and so I think it is only appropriate that the scenes that I play for you are the proposal scenes. I will first play the proposal between Gwendolyn and Jack, and then the proposal scene between Cecily and Algy. For the record, during these scenes, both of the men are pretending to be the fictional Ernest Worthing.
Charming day it has been, Miss Fairfax.
Pray don't talk to me about the weather, Mr. Worthing. Whenever people talk to me about the weather, I always feel quite certain that they mean something else, and that makes me so nervous.
I do mean something else.
I thought so. In fact, I am never wrong.
And I would like to be allowed to take advantage of Lady Bracknell's temporary absence.
I would certainly advise you to do so. Mamma has a way of coming back suddenly into a room that I have often had to speak to her about.
Miss Fairfax, ever since I met you, I have admired you more than any girl I have ever met since I met you.
Yes, I am quite well aware of the fact, and I often wish that in public at any rate you had been more demonstrative. For me, you have always had an irresistible fascination. Even before I met you, I was far from indifferent to you.
Jack looks at her in amazement.
We live, as I hope you know, Mr. Worthing, in an age of ideals. The fact is constantly mentioned in the more expensive monthly magazines, and has reached the provincial pulpits, I am told. And my ideal has always been to love someone of the name of Ernest. There is something in that name that inspires absolute confidence. The moment Algernon first mentioned to me that he had a friend called Ernest, I knew I was destined to love you.
You really love me, Gwendolyn?
Passionately.
Darling, you don't know how happy you've made me.
My own Ernest.
But you don't really mean to say that you couldn't love me if my name wasn't Ernest.
But your name is Ernest.
Yes, I know it is. But supposing it was something else, do you mean to say you couldn't love me then?
Ah, that is clearly a metaphysical speculation, and like most metaphysical speculations, has very little reference at all to the actual facts of real life as we know them.
Personally, darling, to speak quite candidly, I don't much care about the name of Ernest. I don't think the name suits me at all.
It suits you perfectly. It is a divine name. It has a music of its own. It produces vibrations.
Well, really, Gwendolyn, I must say that I think there are lots of other much nicer names. I think Jack, for instance, a charming name.
Jack? No, there is very little music in the name Jack, if any at all indeed. It does not thrill. It produces absolutely no vibrations. I have known several Jacks, and they all, without exception, were more than usually plain. Besides, Jack is a notorious domesticity for John, and I pity any woman who is married to a man called John. She would probably never be allowed to know the entrancing pleasure of a single moment's solitude. The only really safe name is Ernest.
Gwendolyn, I must get christened at once. I mean, we must get married at once. There is no time to be lost.
Married, Mr. Worthing?
Well, surely. You know that I love you, and you led me to believe, Miss Fairfax, that you are not absolutely indifferent to me.
I adore you. But you haven't proposed to me yet. Nothing has been said at all about marriage. The subject has not even been touched upon.
Well, may I propose to you now?
I think it would be an admirable opportunity. And to spare you any possible disappointment, Mr. Worthing, I think it only fair to tell you quite frankly beforehand that I am fully determined to accept you.
Gwendolyn.
Yes, Mr. Worthing? What have you got to say to me?
You know what I have got to say to you.
Yes, but you don't say it.
Gwendolyn, will you marry me?
Goes on his knees.
Of course I will, darling. How long you've been about it. I'm afraid you've had very little experience in how to propose.
My own one, I have never loved anyone in the world but you.
Yes, but men often propose for practice. I know my brother Gerald does. All my girlfriends tell me so. What wonderfully blue eyes you have, Ernest. They are quite, quite blue. I hope you will always look at me just like that, especially when there are other people present.
I hope, Cecily, I shall not offend you if I state quite frankly and openly that you seem to me to be in every way the visible personification of absolute perfection.
I think your frankness does you great credit, Ernest. If you will allow me, I will copy your remarks into my diary.
Goes over to the table and begins writing in diary.
Do you really keep a diary? I'd give anything to look at it. May I?
Oh, no.
Puts her hand over it.
You see, it is simply a very young girl's record of her own thoughts and impressions, and consequently meant for publication. When it appears in volume form, I hope you'll order a copy. But pray, Ernest, don't stop. I delight in taking down from dictation. I have reached absolute perfection. You can go on. I am quite ready for more.
Somewhat taken aback.
Oh, don't cough, Ernest. When one is dictating, one should speak fluently and not cough. Besides, I don't know how to spell a cough.
Writes as Algernon speaks.
Cecily, ever since I first looked upon your wonderful and incomparable beauty, I have dared to love you wildly, passionately, devotedly, hopelessly.
I don't think that you should tell me that you love me wildly, passionately, devotedly, hopelessly. Hopelessly doesn't seem to make much sense, does it?
Cecily!
Enter Merriman.
The dog cart is waiting, sir.
Tell it to come round next week at the same hour.
Looks at Cecily, who makes no sign.
Yes, sir.
Merriman retires.
Uncle Jack would be very much annoyed if he knew you were staying on till next week at the same hour.
Oh, I don't care about Jack. I don't care for anybody in the whole world but you. I love you, Cecily. You will marry me, won't you?
You silly boy. Of course. Why, we have been engaged for the last 3 months.
For the last 3 months?
Yes, it will be exactly 3 months on Thursday.
But how did we become engaged?
Well, ever since dear Uncle Jack first confessed to us that he had a younger brother who was very wicked and bad, you, of course, have formed the chief topic of conversation between myself and Miss Prism. And, of course, a man who is much talked about is always very attractive. One feels there must be something in him after all. I dare say it was foolish of me, but I fell in love with you, Ernest.
Darling. And when was the engagement actually settled?
On the 14th of February last. Worn out by your entire ignorance of my existence, I determined to end the matter one way or the other, and after a long struggle with myself, I accepted you, under this dear old tree here. The next day I bought this little ring in your name, and this is the little bangle with the true lover's knot I promised you always to wear.
Did I give you this? It's very pretty, isn't it?
Yes, you've wonderfully good taste, Ernest. It's the excuse I've always given for your leading such a bad life. And this is the box in which I keep all your dear letters.
Kneels at table, opens box, and produces letters tied up with blue ribbon.
My letters. But, my own sweet Cecily, I have never written you any letters.
You need hardly remind me of that, Ernest. I remember only too well that I was forced to write your letters for you. I wrote always 3 times a week, and sometimes oftener.
Oh, do let me read them, Cecily.
Oh, I couldn't possibly. They would make you far too conceited.
Replaces box.
The 3 you wrote me after I'd broken off the engagement are so beautiful, and so badly spelled, that even now I can hardly read them without crying a little.
But was our engagement ever broken off?
Of course it was. On the 22nd of last March. You can see the entry if you like.
Shows diary.
Today I broke off my engagement with Ernest. I feel it is better to do so. The weather still continues charming.
But why on earth did you break it off? What had I done? I had done nothing at all. Cecily, I am very much hurt indeed to hear you broke it off, particularly when the weather was so charming.
It would hardly have been a really serious engagement if it hadn't been broken off at least once. But I forgave you before the week was out.
Crossing to her and kneeling.
What a perfect angel you are, Cecily.
You dear romantic boy.
He kisses her. She puts her fingers through his hair.
I hope your hair curls naturally, does it?
Yes, darling, with a little help from others.
I'm so glad.
You'll never break off our engagement again, Cecily.
I don't think I could break it off now that I've actually met you.
All right, what did you think? How would each of these ladies dress? Please explain your thoughts below. And while you're there, you might as well subscribe to get notified every time one of my videos comes out. I hope that all of you had a great CosTube Symposium, and if you're watching this after the weekend is done, make sure to check out the playlist that I'll have linked in the description to watch all of the videos that were released. Have a great week, and I'll see you soon.